To start, I want to make sure we keep this rolling. These fine people have come from all over the state, all the way from Salem and let's see, we got Salem, Quincy, Medway. Oh, so you're actually almost close. Oh, Fenway. Oh, the Fenway. Yeah. So we want to make sure they're able to get back in time. Thank you all for coming. Hopefully, we'll have a great conversation tonight. I'm Shawn Dooley. I'm the state representative for the 9th Norfolk, so for Plainville, Rentham, Norfolk, Millis, Medfield, Walpole. Been working with Mass Housing and DHCD and the other organizations for the 4 years that I've been up there. One of the things that I want to say about tonight is about information. We're going to be taking questions, and we're going to have a whole question section at the end. But what we really want to do is make sure these guys get out to all of you what affordable housing really is, what safe harbor means, what the 40B law is, the pros, the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, so we have a good understanding of what it is and what we can do about it and how it affects Norfolk. So just as a way of introduction, Nancy McDonald is Director of Government Affairs for Mass Housing. George O'Toole is, there's George is in the front. He's Government Affairs as well with Mass Housing. Greg Wasson is in the middle there, the Manager of Comprehensive Permits for Mass Housing. Phil DeMartino, I'll see if I get this all right. Technical Assistant Coordinator, Office of Sustainable Communities at Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. All right, perfect. And he came all the way down from Salem. So, and Ray Goff, the Norfolk Town Planner. Also, Tim Hughes is in the back. He's my Chief of Staff. On the camera is Shannon Freuza, my Communications Director, and then Nick Samarco will be coming around as well to help pick up cards throughout the evening. Any questions anybody has, write them down, and we're going to be able to try to bang through them as many as possible at the end of the meeting. And Nick's in charge of my community outreach. A few other people down in the front here. We have Scott Bugby, Jim Lehan, and Jeff Palumbo are the Norfolk Selectmen. Scott, are you chair now?
Not yet.
Not yet? So Jeff's still chair?
Correct.
Okay, so Jeff's our chair, even though they're about to have their reorganization, I'm sure. And I think, and Jeff Chalmers from the Norfolk and King Philip School Committee is in the middle, and I apologize if there's anyone else, any other elected officials here that I missed. But thank you all very much for coming. What we're going to be doing is kind of give a little overview of the 40B process and what the state's role is in it at overall first. But just please keep your questions to the end. Write them down. If you need an index card, just raise your hand, and my guys will be coming out, running around and grabbing them. And just remember, these people, I'm very, very blessed from the standpoint of I have a great relationship with these folks. They have never done this for any town in the Commonwealth. All these people are giving up their evening. This is their own free time. This isn't part of their job. And they've never done it before. So we're very, very fortunate in Norfolk to have the state officials who are actually in charge of this. So we really want to give them a great showing about what Norfolk's all about, why we're concerned, and we're going to try to stay away from individual specifics on each individual project. Unfortunately, by law, there's a lot of things on cases that are currently before them and pending they can't obviously discuss. So just keep that in mind. We're going to try to be as open and transparent as we possibly can, but don't get frustrated if there's something you don't know. Call me afterwards or see me afterwards, and I'll make sure I get the information to you as much as I can. I'll sit with them offline, and we'll get any and all information back to, and answer every question we can possibly think of. So without further ado, Phil, I guess you're going to start with the overview. Nope, it's Phil. So you gave me this. You gave me the itinerary, and you have 7:05 to 7:10. Philip DeMartino.
Just too excited.
Nancy McDonald.
Thank you. Well, as the only woman at the table, I thought I should just get my turn quickly. Hi, everybody. My name is Nancy McDonald. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Mass Housing. We're very pleased to be here tonight. I want to thank Representative Dooley for giving us the opportunity to come and do this. As the representative said, this actually isn't something that we've ever really done before, and it's not that we don't want to talk about 40B or answer your questions. It's just that this is not typically how we, have structured our responses on things like this. But you should know that your state representative has been a terrific resource to us and a partner for us in the sense that while he's never shy about telling us what he's concerned about, at the same time, he also is wanting to have a dialogue and is wanting to understand what we're working on. And I think that tonight's event is really a good example of that, because he said to us, I really wish that you could come down and kind of take everybody through the process of how a 40B comes to you, how you review it, how it goes through the process, because he said, I don't think people always understand that. And he said, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think he's right, because we do hear this from other communities. People don't always understand how the process works. And I know that there are some of you who may have an interest in particular projects in Norfolk. I still think that while we won't get into those specific questions, this should help you understand a little bit better about how that will all come to be reviewed over time with Mass Housing. I think it's also important to just sort of tell folks who Mass Housing is, because I realize as I start to talk to more communities that people don't always know who we are or what we do. So Mass Housing is actually what's known as a quasi-public agency. We were created by an act of the Massachusetts State Legislature in 1966. So we just had our 50th anniversary. We're sometimes called the state's affordable housing bank, but we have two primary functions. One is to make loans to low and moderate income first-time home buyers. And we do those loans, this is all separate and apart from 40B, because 40B is just really a very small part of what we do. So we make those loans through partner lenders all across the state. So we have lending partners that are all the banks that would be down in your area. And we have the other part of our business is rental lending that we do that does mixed income housing, so it would have a market component, so market rate rents in conjunction with affordable rents. And I actually pulled some of the numbers before I came down just to give you a sense that in the town of Norfolk, just in the last 5 years, we've actually done 16 mortgages in your area for folks that were first-time home buyers. So these would be folks that went to the local bank and said, I'd like to get a mortgage, and when they partner with Mass Housing, they have lower down payment requirements for their loans. We also can help serve a population that has sometimes a slightly lower credit score, although not typically. We still have borrowers who are in the mid-700s with a credit score. But as an example, in the last 5 years, the average income for a borrower in Norfolk was about $70,000. So someone that was borrowing and getting a Mass Housing mortgage in Norfolk was about $70,000. It's ticked up a little bit in the last couple of years. Just in 2017, it was an average of $87,000 with the person that we were making a loan to. So those are borrowers, and that's a key part of what Mass Housing's business is, to try to help people, get loans for the first time. We also have, specific lending programs, and we put some information out in the hallway because I thought it might just be helpful for folks if you're interested or you have people in your family that are trying to purchase a home. I have a daughter who's graduating from college in 2 weeks, and I hope that someday she won't just be moving back to my house, but maybe she'll be buying her own home. So I understand how important that is. And we also have a lending program for veterans that we're very proud of called Operation Welcome Home, which is actually a little bit more competitive than the VA program. So if you have folks in your family or in your community that you know who are veterans or who are in the National Guard, we're happy to talk to you if you have any questions about that. So as I said, I really want to thank Representative Dooley and thank the members of the Board of Selectmen for coming tonight, and thank all of you for your openness and ask for your open mind to sort of listen to all of the description of what mass housing does. I'm grateful to my colleagues from DHCD, Phil DeMartino, and my colleague Greg Watson and George O'Toole from Mass Housing for coming down, and Ray Goff, the town planner, has done a lot of great work for tonight too. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And now, Phil, I won't jump on your time anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a lot to cover tonight. So, again, I work for the Department of Housing and Community Development, so we're the state agency. So, frankly, the 40B buck stops with us. We oversee the program and have done that since 1969. What I think a lot of people don't realize about 40B, there's really 4 players in it. It's DHCD, Mass Housing Partnership, and Mass Development. And Greg will go into this in more detail. As far as what we do, DHCD with 40B, we house the Housing Appeals Committee, which is when a project gets denied locally or approved with so many conditions the developer thinks it's not an economic project. They appeal to DHCD at the Housing Appeals Committee. That's a 5-member quasi-judicial board. DHCD staff, but it's a total separate entity. They've got their own staff. If they need information from us, they write us a letter. It's a very strong firewall between the two of us. We oversee what's called the Local Action Unit Program, which is part of the Local Initiative Program, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking a lot of acronyms. That's basically friendly 40B. If a community has a 40B project they actually like, and it does happen, the municipality will support it, and it makes the process go a lot quicker because the developer knows there's less likelihood of being appealed and end up in court at the HAC or SJC or land court, which can happen. I oversee the Housing Production Plan Program, which is a way to basically help communities get safe harbor. And safe harbor is a general term, meaning you get either a 1 or a 2-year moratorium from the 40B process, because I understand the 10% number to a lot of communities is overwhelming, and we'll get into how we calculate that later. So there's various safe harbors, which I'll get into in a quick PowerPoint after Greg, I believe. We maintain the 10% list, and technically, it's called the Subsidized Housing Inventory. To get on the list, affordable housing has to be affordable up to 80% of the area median income. And before I came down, I think 80% for a family of 4 up here is about $75,000, so it's fairly high now. I think there's a misconception with 40B that it's really low-income housing, it's public housing. The reality is, particularly if you're dealing with ownership projects, you've got to be bankable, you've got to be able to qualify for a mortgage, and you've got to have at least a decent income. We oversee the regulations and guidelines, so whenever there's changes, and there's been a lot of changes since 1969 when it was enacted, we oversee that process. And we can issue, Greg will get into, what's called project eligibility letters to go ahead and do a project. So I think that's it. I'm just a very quick overview of what we do at DHCD. Again, most of the projects are actually done by Mass Housing Partnership, but we do have a good line of communication between all the agencies that work in it. And I want to thank the representative for having us down here, because I think this is the type of thing, the more people talk about it, there's a lot of misconceptions. I realize, because I've been working on 40B for about 15 years, a lot of issues with it as well. So we're always looking at ways to improve it, and we do want dialogue. So I'll leave it at that and hand it off to Greg.
Hey, as it was said, my name is Greg Watson, and I manage the comprehensive permit programs at Mass Housing. Have worked closely with people in this community over a number of projects in the past few years, and we want to talk a little bit tonight with you about what does the process look like, why is it so important, and how do you navigate the process as a community to get to where you may want to be. So I start with a premise of why is 40B becoming so widely used in areas like Norfolk. And a big part of the reason why 40B has really become very prevalent is the Commonwealth has an underlying affordability problem. The chart that is up on the screen now indicates that for a number of years, Massachusetts was very comparable to the rest of the country in terms of where our sales prices were for our homes. And sometime around 1980, we started pulling away. And when that move happened, we very quickly jumped to a place where we're over 6 times higher than, or the rate of the growth of how sales have increased in the Commonwealth is at a rate higher than any other state in the country. One of the underlying reasons for those sale prices going so high is that we have had a significant decline in producing housing, not just affordable housing, but housing of any type. We did a fairly decent job of that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and in the past 3 decades, that really has tailed off significantly. So that really brings us to why 40B came around in the first place. It was adopted by the legislature back in 1969. It is referred to as both the Comprehensive Permit Law as well as the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. I feel like that's the more catchy term, but the basic premise of 40B is that it enables a developer to apply to your local zoning board of appeals and submit a project that would be approved under more flexible zoning than what would otherwise be allowed under Norfolk's zoning ordinance or bylaw. And in exchange for that flexible zoning, the developer is required to set aside a certain percentage of those units as affordable. So that's really the quid pro quo. Developer gets enhanced zoning, the community gets affordable housing. As Phil mentioned, the state has established a goal that each community should strive toward reaching 10% of their overall housing units as being set aside as affordable. Those units that are eligible for inclusion on what's known as the subsidized housing inventory start to allow a community to make strides toward achieving that goal. When you've met the goal of having 10% of your units affordable, provides the community with a lot more discretion around whether or not you are going to approve any future projects. As Phil mentioned, there are a number of agencies that are involved in approving and reviewing 40B developments. DHCD, where Phil works, is one of those, and they manage what's known as the LIP program, or Local Initiative Program, where they work very closely with communities on coming up with a 40B development that meets both state and local goals for producing housing. Both Mass Housing Partnership and Mass Development operate programs that are tied to specific types of financing that they offer to developers who build exclusively rental housing. And at Mass Housing, we have our own lending programs that are connected to rental development, but we also administer what is known as the New England Fund, and that is comprised of banks who are members of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston. So 40B has, since its inception, has really been a pretty powerful tool in not just creating affordable housing, but creating housing throughout the Commonwealth. It has produced over almost 70,000 units in that time frame, of which more than 35,000 are actually restricted as affordable. This is a pretty significant number, and it outpaces any other program that we're aware of. That success, though, and what 40B has been able to accomplish doesn't come without a little bit of controversy, and that's a big part of why we're all here to talk with one another tonight, is that there is pushback sometimes when these projects come to a local community. And some of that has to do with a fear of change and what is going to be the impact of this development on my neighborhood or my school system or the places that are important to me and that make up the reasons why I came here in the first place. And so those concerns have to be balanced by what the program is intended to accomplish, and that's producing housing and more specifically affordable housing. And I think it's important to note that at the heart of this controversy and the resistance that many communities have toward this process. We only have 48 of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts that have reached that 10% threshold. Multifamily housing in particular represents a challenge in this context. And what this map here is intending to indicate is that these communities that are highlighted in blue here, that's not a reservoir or new oceanfront property, it actually represents the communities that do most of the multifamily zoning in the state. So those 10 communities do more than 50% of all the multifamily zoning in the Commonwealth. And beyond that, there are over 200 communities that have never done any version, not even a two-family dwelling. And that's another part of what makes housing and the affordability gap that we face here in the Commonwealth particularly daunting. So talk a little bit about the tension that exists around 40B, and it's really rooted in the tradition of Chapter 40A, which is the state's zoning enabling legislation. At the heart of 40A is this tradition of home rule. And home rule is what gives each city and town the ability to create their own rules about development, how you're going to zone for both the types of uses that you allow in various parts of your community, as well as the dimensional requirements that factor in around those uses. And 40B, as was described earlier, overrides a lot of those local rules and some of those restrictions. I put this graphic up partly because we're in the neighborhood of Foxborough and Gillette Stadium, and we're still hopefully basking in the glow of the Patriots' victory this past February. But this is intended to show what the typical zoning looks like in most communities that are predominantly zoned for single-family housing with large lot, acre or acre plus zoning districts. So this is what a home looks like on an acre plus lot. I think if you look at the green area of Gillette Stadium, it's about 1.3 acres. And it accommodates a McMansion pretty well. And that's what that's really kind of what the problem is when people see what can be done under 40B that looks so different from what you would otherwise do under your existing zoning. So what is our role in this process? I want to get through that as quickly as I can, but it all starts with the process of determining whether a project is eligible to apply in the first place. So we make an initial determination of project eligibility. That involves a number of various steps, and I'll go into them in a minute. Actually, we keep going through this. After we've made a determination of project eligibility one way or the other, the developer or applicant is able to make an application to the local zoning board of appeals. The zoning board of appeals opens a hearing, and then they, after holding a number of hearings and considering the merits of the project, they're in a position of making a decision. They can either approve the project as it was submitted to them and moves on through the process. They can approve it with conditions, or they can deny the project. In the case of a denial or conditions that render the project essentially uneconomic, as Phil mentioned, there's a path of appeal directly for that developer to the Housing Appeals Committee, which resides at DHCD. When you get through the local permitting process and survive any appeals, you then come back to the subsidizing agency for what's known as final approval. That's an important part of the process that imposes certain regulatory restrictions on the development. From there, a developer is able to apply for local building permits, and once building permits are issued and construction has happened, the project has hopefully been very successful in either selling or renting up all of the units within the development. They come back to the subsidizing agency and go through what's known as cost certification, where there is a very clear understanding of whether or not the project exceeded any profit limitations that are imposed by the program. And throughout the lifespan of the development, because most likely, if this was approved by a comprehensive permit by the local zoning board of appeals, there's going to be affordability restrictions that are perpetual. So we put in place rules and restrictions that govern how that affordability will be managed over time. So just diving into the site approval or project eligibility part of this process a little bit more closely, we make a number of general findings, and those findings are outlined in both the regulations and further amplified by guidance that DHCD has issued around these matters. And we make very general findings, and that's a word that you'll see it up here a number of times, that is the site generally appropriate for housing? Is the project generally eligible under the subsidy program? So the threshold here is really not particularly high, because there's a built-in incentive to want people to be able to at least have an opportunity to make their case before a local board. As I mentioned, when a developer comes back to us for final approval, I think this is really one of the more critical parts of what Mass Housing can do to ensure the integrity of this process and make sure that we help the developer live up to the part of the bargain where they provide the affordable housing. So when we impose a regulatory agreement on a development, that it makes sure that they have the long-term affordability. In the case of a for-sale development, that's in the form of a deed restriction. So every affordable unit that gets sold within that development has a deed restriction attached to it. We also secure that deed restriction with a mortgage so that it can't be missed somehow in a title search, that it's very clear that that restriction is in place. On the rental side, we go into a use restriction, essentially, and obligate the developer to provide us with annual updates about their compliance with the affordability of the tenants occupying those affordable units. Another important part of what gets put into place here is the provisions for the cost for certification and verifying that the applicant and the developer have met the profit limitations that are imposed by the program. And essentially, that means that they're going to do that work, and they're going to let Mass Housing evaluate whether or not they've complied with both programmatic and statutory requirements. So just to talk about that a little bit further, cost certification is another way where we can really make it clear that a developer is following the rules. And this is an important aspect of what we do, is the developer has agreed to restrict their profits. In the case of a for-sale development, their profit cannot exceed 20% of their total development cost when compared with the revenue generated by the project. In the case of a rental development, they are restricted to not more than 10% of an annual distribution, and that's determined based on developer equity and the amount of debt that they're holding, as well as part of what we do working with them during this process. So as I mentioned, the affordability monitoring is something that is an ongoing process when a development is put into operation. And I think it's really important that the developer complies with this element of what's required of them in Chapter 40B. And this is something that we make a real effort to not only ensure compliance, but that we give the developer and the people who are interested in pursuing opportunities to potentially purchase or rent an affordable unit, the kinds of resources that they need to understand how to navigate that process. What typically will happen is a unit will be made available through a lottery. That lottery goes through a very specific process that's outlined in the guidelines that DHCD has promulgated. They also go through a process of being monitored by an affordability monitoring agent that is essentially working on our behalf to ensure that every single person who applies for one of those units is properly income eligible, and that a unit isn't going to someone who is not entitled to it. I want to talk a little bit about the communities that have done enough by way of producing affordable housing to reach that 10% threshold, and put this out there as part of a goal that communities are all striving to achieve. And as I said earlier, only 48 of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts have met that goal. And there's a long way to go for a lot of places. Norfolk's not alone. We've added the SHI number for Norfolk, and currently they're at 3.6% of the units in this town. But there's a lot of potential for new units to be added. I'm not going to get too much into the housing production plan process because this is really Phil's area of expertise at DHCD, but I just wanted to mention that this is one way that communities can essentially take their housing production efforts into their own hands and chart their own course relative to how housing gets built. So it starts with developing a plan, then you work towards a process of getting that plan certified, which basically means you've built housing under it. And then you're able to make some of your own decisions about housing. Phil will go into a lot more detail about that. Right now, this map shows places where a housing production plan is current or where they've expired. Norfolk is on the list of communities where there was previously a housing production plan, and that has since expired. I think that was back in 2012. And there are only 6 communities on this map that have not only adopted and approved a housing production plan, but that have taken the steps to get it certified and achieve that safe harbor that gives them more discretion around local decisions. Mass Housing is also looking to get into the space where we could be helpful to communities in making some of these decisions about how do you plan for your future. This is a program that we're still developing. It's not quite ready for prime time, but we thought we would communicate that that's part of where we would like to be. We don't always want to be the place that you go to when you want to express frustration with a project that came through an applicant that is exclusively under 40B. We would like to be partners with communities, not just Norfolk, but all the communities in the Commonwealth, about how did they move their housing agenda forward. This map indicates that there are really a number of communities, there's 70 listed here, that are between 7 and 10% of their subsidized housing inventory. So there's a lot of communities that are very close, and we would love to be partners with them in helping them achieve their housing goals and move them forward. This map looks at currently where Mass Housing's already built 40B developments are located. And I find this a little bit interesting because as you can see by the line of where the housing is located, it really is focused in eastern Massachusetts and really concentrated in greater Boston. I think one of the complaints around 40B is that it's this one-size-fits-all program, and it doesn't always work everywhere. And I think this map speaks to some of that it hasn't been a tool that has been widely used west of 495, for that matter. In addition to the projects that are already built, we have, this just amplifies the existing pipeline in Massachusetts, so under Mass Housing's review. So again, it follows the same pattern of development where we're pretty much in this eastern portion. So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that we have had a whole bunch more applications in the past 3 years than we have in the years that preceded that. So where this chart starts is just a little bit after the housing bust. And when the markets kind of came back down after the credit crisis, things really kind of leveled off, and we had pretty modest interest from developers in pursuing these kinds of applications. But you can see here in 2013 and 14, 15, things started to pick up, And we are at a point this year where we expect to probably do at least 10 or 15 more applications than what we've had in the 2 most recent years. One of the things that's also interesting about the way that not only has the number of applications shifted upward, but we've seen a lot more interest in pursuing rental development as a solution for housing in the communities that the development community is interested in. One of the things that I think both the current regulations have introduced to the 40B process that have, I think, really enhanced the credibility of the review that all of the subsidizing agencies undertake is that it has introduced some design criteria. And that happened just fairly recently in 2008, where DHCD imposed some language around how do you evaluate the impacts that the proposed design may have on the existing community. One of the ways that we evaluate those design implications is in the architectural renderings and plans that are submitted to us for review. And what I'm trying to indicate here is that this is a typical single-family home in a suburban community. The structure on the right, or I guess it's, yeah, you're right, Mike, is a 3-family home, but that has many of the same design characteristics as what you see here. You have the peaked roofs, you have a similar roof line and height. You also have a bulk and scale of the structure that is really relatively comparable to that of the single-family home. And that's something that we can guide developers down a path of improving the nature of the development that they are attempting to propose within a community. And I think that's not an area of the process that just has to stop with our input, that's something that the community can continue to work with the developer around as the process unfolds. As importantly as the architectural elements of the proposal, we look very closely at the site plan requirements. And this is a site, this is the same plan. I'm not going to name the community right now, just to protect the developer's interest here, but this is an initial application that was submitted to Mass Housing. And things about this application that raised some pretty big flags for myself and my staff as we were beginning to undertake our review is that you had a site plan that was really focused almost entirely on paved surfaces. You can see some green space here, but a lot of what is green, particularly the dark green areas, are protected wetlands. So what was actually available for open space was very limited and was focused pretty much on the surrounding the building and in the parking dividers. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was just the design of the buildings. These buildings were incredibly long, and they had a bulk and a massing to them that the architect had a difficult time breaking down to respond better to the existing context of that site. So we pushed back and suggested to the developer that you need to go back and rework this proposal. And what they came back with, while still being able to meet the goals for development for that site that they had intended, was a project that fit the characteristics of that site and the community far better than their initial proposal. One of the ways they did that was they focused some of the interior portions of the site around courtyard areas, and all of those areas were connected by walking paths, and you had more green space available around the exterior of the site that was not just wetlands. They also put a fair amount of the parking below grade, which helped to reduce the number of impervious surface areas that existed on the site. And they reoriented both the size and scale of the buildings. So these buildings are now no longer as substantial in both length and breadth and volume as the initial proposal. And they also turned the where the buildings get located in relationship to the existing roadway. So you have a road here that comes by the site. They've turned the buildings so that what you see driving by the site is the gable end and the narrowest portion of the building. So again, that its impact, while still a big structure, and I wouldn't argue that point, is now at least mitigated by the way that it's been cited on that particular plan. They've also ringed the exterior of the site with lower scale 2.5-story development that is far more in keeping with what is found in that surrounding context of the neighbors around the exterior of the site. So I think, that's a really critical role that we all play in that, and we don't just look at that necessarily on our own. We have numerous meetings with the developers, and sometimes we even bring in the opinions of other agencies to make sure that we are approving projects that really meet the purpose and intent of the program. As Phil will probably talk a little bit, this is a role that DHCD plays under the local initiative program, but any 40B can technically be a friendly 40B, and really all that is required for that to happen is for both the applicant and the community to seek some common ground, to work a little bit more collaboratively, to work towards an outcome that works for the developer as well as the community. And we certainly have seen instances where we've helped to broker relationships between the developer and the community that result in projects that are much better outcomes for everyone involved. One of the things that, in addition to having a housing production plan and doing work to move your community forward, there are efforts that can be undertaken in other areas of zoning to put a community in a better light relative to how a subsidizing agency will view a pending 40B application that is in front of that agency for determination of project eligibility. One of the things that the regulations and the guidelines now ask us to consider is whether or not there has been some previous municipal action outside of Chapter 40B that has produced housing that is significant enough to really disincentivize the notion that you need to have a 40B development come in and serve the role of producing that affordable housing. So these are a couple of communities, a couple of examples of communities that have done work that is of that nature. In Easton, they created a 40R district, and they also contributed over $7.5 million to a friendly 40B process with a developer to take an existing Shovel Works property. This is the former Ames Shovel Works in Easton, and there was a lot of collaboration on both sides, and they came out with a project that was far superior to a couple of 40B applications that had been submitted around the same time. It led Mass Housing to deny the 40B applications that were presented to us in favor of what the community had already lent their support to. In a similar vein, Reading is a community that has adopted multiple 40R districts, one right in their downtown, another in an area very proximate to easy access to highways and transit. And they've also just recently approved a 40B development in their town center that is linked to public transit and has really demonstrated that they are committed to advancing not just their goals, but the goals that the state have put out there for them around housing development. So I put those out there as examples of communities where, because they have taken that work on themselves, they've put themselves in a position where 40B isn't necessarily the only answer or solution to advancing the affordable housing agenda. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and I will turn it back over to Phil, who's going to get into a little bit more depth around the housing production process.
If you have questions, please, raise your hand and, make sure you have an index card, pass them out. Make sure we keep those if you need some. And if you already have one, Please write it down so we can collect them and start coming together. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay.
Oh, here it is.
That's fine.
Click on the slide.
Quick question. Will
Sure.
the slides be available after the presentation?
Yes. I'll make sure we get them all out to you.
Okay. Sure. Okay, I'm quickly going to talk about some municipal safe harbors, ways to get relief from 40B. The biggest program we probably have is called Housing Production Plans. This was enacted back in 2003, and I was driving out here, I'm thinking there's a lot of similarities between the 2003 housing market and now. We have an extremely hot housing market. As Greg mentioned, 40B is really reflective of the housing market in general. If the private market is accelerating, 40B activity will accelerate along with it. If things are falling apart, the 40B market will fall down with it. Basically, if a community adopts a housing production plan, and I'll briefly go over the regulations, they can either get 1 or 2 years off depending on the amount of production. And I have the numbers for all the communities in this district coming up on a slide. If they do half of 1% of units that count towards the 40B list, the subsidized housing inventory, SHI, they essentially get a year off. If they do 1%, they get 2 years off. We actually lowered these goals in 2008 to get more communities certified, and the next time we change the regulations, which I'm not sure when that will be, there's a possibility we might get down lower because we really, want communities to be able to do more planning and sort of not be overwhelmed with the process. So since 2003, we've had over 50 communities certified at various times. We've had over 100 plans submitted. This is a voluntary program. There's no requirement for towns to do it. I always tell people, you're foolish not to do it, because if you end up getting a big 40B, you may lose out on some time off because you don't have a valid plan. They're good for 5 years, and if you have the Community Preservation Act or housing trust funds, a lot of times you can use public funds, those funds to get the plans. Frankly, most of the plans now, not exclusively, are either done with the RPAs or private consultants. Some towns do have the in-house capability to do it. 3 main sections, comprehensive needs assessment, affordable housing goals, and implementation strategies. The plans have to be approved by the planning board and board of selectmen, or city council if you're a city, submitted by the chief executive officer. They don't need town meeting passage, but they do need to be approved locally. So sometimes we'll get various committees send us plans. If the folks that have to sign off by the regulations don't sign off, we can't accept the plans. Implementation strategies must include growth areas, zoning districts, specific sites for 40B. And when I talk about specific, I've had to get pretty flexible as far as what's specific, if that makes sense. If you have a town that has very little water and sewer, but the water and sewer is downtown, and that's where they want the activity of new housing construction to go, that makes sense. If they've got a senior center and a vacant lot, they want to do senior housing next to it, that's something to think about. Preferred residential mixed-use characteristics. If you have any municipal-owned parcels, at least a pledge that you're going to explore doing some housing on municipal parcels, because if you give land over to a developer, that lowers down the construction costs and makes a project more viable. So we've had towns, donate old schools or just land to oftentimes do a friendly 40B. On the other hand, I also understand towns are always looking for money. If you have a site that's worth money, they oftentimes would rather just sell it. I wouldn't get too much hung up on this. Whoops, not on the lights right here. This last one, regional housing development collaboratives. You don't really have to build housing in conjunction with another community. It would just be something like, this is a regional forum, working with the RPAs, some dialogue between different communities. Now, how does the housing production plan process work? The first thing you do, as I mentioned earlier, you need a housing production plan in place, and it has to be valid. You need to produce the units within the same calendar year for which you request the certification. And I have a slide coming up that has all the towns and the respective units for either a 1 or 2 year safe harbor. The units count at the initial point of eligibility. Now, this gets a little technical because depending on what type of permitting you use, the units can be counted on the SHI before actual construction. In the case of a comprehensive permit, if, say, the Norfolk ZBA signs off on a permit tonight, the town clerk signs on it tomorrow, those units are considered existing affordable housing as far as the state's concerned, even though there's not a physical unit there. Now, if you're doing something through inclusionary zoning, or you're using, say, Community Preservation Act money through the local action program, it could be building permits or occupancy permits. So if you're not sure, just please call us right away so we can tell you, when things are going to start. And the last one's important, regardless of the date of certification notice, when we send it out to you, that's when the certification starts. And I'll go back to a comprehensive permit because, frankly, most of the towns that have been able to get certified have done comprehensive permits because that gives you the big numbers. And that clock on the certification starts, in the case I was talking about earlier, the day the clerk signs off, the night after it's approved. So be careful on that. The request has to be submitted by either the chief executive officer, that can be the town manager or the board of selectmen, depending on your charter. We have a 30-day internal review process. It usually doesn't take that long. Although sometimes I'm surprised. I think, some towns, they may not have a planner. There could be a change. They've actually done the comprehensive permit. They have a plan, and we don't find out about it right away. There's 351 cities and towns. We don't monitor everyone that closely. So sometimes it actually takes a concerned citizen to sort of tip us off that something's happening. Other towns are literally, I've been dealing a lot with Brookline, who had about 10 or 11 applications. They hit their certification on Tuesday, and they literally came in Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock in the lobby, with the package because they wanted that safe harbor. Now, these are the 3 original statutory minimum, and these go back to 1969. Now, the first one Greg talked about, the 10%. If you look at who's at 10%, frankly, it's mostly cities, because places like Brockton, Worcester, Fitchburg, Haverhill, they have very big public housing stocks existing, thousands of units, so they count towards the subsidized housing inventory. On the other hand, we have had towns be able to go over 10%, places like Bedford, Concord, Dedham, and Westford. The way they've been able to do it really is through rentals, because there's a little quirk in our guidelines where if you do a rental development, 80% of the units at 25% affordable, we count 100% of the units. If you do 20% at 50% AMI, which is just the lower income range, we do 100% of the units. So when you drive up and down 128 and you see Avalon or all these big national developers come in, they're almost exclusively 40B, and they all count towards the list. So you can really get your numbers up quickly. You can get 200 or 300 units. Some towns have adopted what I call the Hail Mary approach. They're at 2 or 3%. They're a fairly small town, but 200 units will get them to 10%, and they just sort of, bite the bullet and do one big one, and they're done with it for quite a period of time. The second one here, there's been a lot of talk about the 1.5 general land area mass, and I'm not going to get too much into that. I will leave the slide up here for about a few minutes. We're issuing new guidelines on it, I hope by the end of the month. We didn't have any activity at the Safe Harbor until about 2 years ago. And in the last 2 years, we've had, I think it's 8 communities now invoke it, including Newton, Norwood, Milton, Arlington, Waltham, Milton, Bridgewater, and Stoneham. It's the guide that's sort of getting this is contained within the regulations, and that's the appropriate citation. But it's been a tough one for the towns to sort of sort out, and frankly for us to sort out. A lot of it has ended up in the HAC, the SJC. So we have a working group. We're about to issue the guidance on that, and it's been very litigious on both sides. So we should get that sorted out, I hope, in the next couple of weeks. The third one I'm not even going to get into because no one has really been able to prove that since 1969. No one's been able to invoke it. Community has more than 1/3 of 1% of low and moderate income housing. That's things on the 40B list. Of the city or town's land area, or 10 acres, whichever is greater. The only way I could think that would work is a fairly small community with a very large project. But again, I don't want to worry about that one too much because it's never been used. Now, in 2003 and 2008, we added some more safe harbors. These are in the regulations, not the statute. Recent progress, produced 2% SHI eligible housing within 12 months. That's basically outside of housing production plans. If you had a really big housing development come in without a housing production plan, you ended up approving, you'd get a year off for doing 2%, and I have those numbers. Large-scale projects, caps project size between 150 and 300 units, depending on the size of the community, unless the ZBA wants to do a larger project. Now, I realize for communities like this, that's still big numbers. I think most of the large-scale projects, with the exception of Walpole in this district, stands at 200 units, which is still, a pretty big project. But there is at least some cap as to the maximum size, because before we had this, occasionally we would get some very, very large proposals come in. Related applications enables towns to reject a 40B application if a developer submitted an application for the same site for a non-40B development or a site that contained less than 10% affordable housing within 12 months. Translation, that was basically to stop market rate developers who came in and said, if you don't give me approval for this or a special permit, I'm going to come back with a 40B. At least now is a 12-month cooling off period to allow some negotiation. That did happen a lot. There was a lot of, sort of, I'll bring down the 40B hammer on you unless you play ball with us. And a board can also stay the commencement if they have 3 or more applications going on at one time, or if the total project numbers are below the large project limit, which I'll get into, whichever is bigger. But that doesn't happen very often. But we are seeing some communities now, like I'll mention Brookline again. I think they had 10 or 11 40Bs at one time. So we don't want ZBAs to be totally overwhelmed, because these are volunteer boards. By statute regulations, the ZBA is really the 40B permitting agency through all the communities. And oftentimes people get on ZBAs and they're, it's usually somebody wants to build a deck or they need a small variance. And then all of a sudden they've got a large controversial apartment complex to deal with. So it's not an easy thing for ZBAs to handle. So whether or not you've got 10%, 1.5%, your certified housing production plan, this is the way it works with the ZBA. So the first thing I'll backtrack is once you have a complete comprehensive permit application, the ZBA has 30 days to open up the hearing. Within 15 days, they have to notify the applicant, that's the developer, that they think they've achieved one of these various safe harbors. And send that information up to DHCD. The applicant has 15 days to challenge it. So there's a bit of back and forth. Frankly, if you're at 10% or have a certified housing production plan, there's not usually this process, because if you're way over 10%, a developer's usually not going to pursue a 40B unless it's a friendly one. If you have a certified housing production plan, you're going to have a letter from us saying you're certified from, January 5th, 2017 to January 4th, 2019. They're not going to pursue it. The 1.5 gets a little dicey. Related applications will sometimes happen. We have 30 days, we being DHCD, to issue a decision. Now, if the developer's not happy with the decision or the town's not happy, they can apply to what's called an interlocutory appeal, which is just a fancy legal word to mean an expedited appeal at the Housing Appeals Committee. This is where most of these 1.5 cases have ended up in the last couple of years. And frankly, it's not that expedited because these appeals can take upwards of a year. And this isn't even an appeal at the final end stage project. This is whether or not to see if they've achieved a safe harbor. So the last thing is in red, and that's the most important thing. The safe harbor, in order to really block or stop a 40B project, you have to have the safe harbor in place at the time of application. So if you've got 3 or 4 40Bs going on at the same time, and one 40B is at day 58, there's a 180-day window to do the process, although they can extend it. If you're at day 58 and you hit, say, 10%, that one's going to keep going because it's beyond the 15-day notification period. On the other hand, if you've got the safe harbor, somebody comes in and applies for a brand new 40B, you're at 10% or 1.5, you still have to open the hearing, but you can then block it with these 15-day notification periods. So just be careful about that, because if you notify them on day 16 or day 17, you could be out of luck. On the other hand, too, if a developer comes in and files a day before you hit a safe harbor, the development will likely go forward. And there's a bit of gamemanship that happens sometimes between towns and developers, and, there's a lot of things moving around. So I'll just leave this slide up for a second, longer, I think. So I hope I got all the communities in your district represented. If I did this quickly. So it looks like everyone's kind of hovering around between 3 and 4%. Plainville's at 5.5%, just over 5%. The second line here, the half of 1%, 1%, these are the production numbers that the communities, if they have housing production plans, would need. So in other words, to get a moratorium, Medfield would need 21 units, half of 1% to get a year, 42 units for 2 years. The second column on the bottom there, these are the year-round housing units. 40B is basically based on your production numbers, the 10% on the Seminole Census. So every 10 years, we get the numbers from the Census Department, this year-round housing units. So, Medfield has 4,200. Their large-scale project is 200. Walpole's the biggest community, it looks like, so they're up to 300. So that's something to think about. So every 10 years, when you add new units every year, we don't play around with the denominator or numerator. It's sort of settled. Now in 2020, 2021, if there's new census data, the numbers can change. And what we did have at one point about 57, 58 communities above 10%. A lot of them were at 10.5, 10.6%. They ended up building a lot of housing, frankly, through 40B, so they can fall below. My advice is I use Bedford as an example. They hit 10%. They're actually, I think, at about 14.5%. They've adopted inclusionary zoning, so they'll never be behind 40B again because whatever development comes in, they're adding new units that count, so they're continually getting ahead of it. They did have to build a lot of apartments in a short period of time to do it, but it's possible. And the last slide is just basically housing production plans. It looks like Walpole and Medfield are still valid. I think we're going to talk about Norfolk in a second. Again, it's a voluntary program, but the HPPs, we've had over 100 communities submitted, over 50 certified. And you have to think about, if we go out in Western Mass, and I do other things other than 40B, 40B is not an issue in Western Mass, as Greg was saying. I grew up in North Worcester County, very little 40B activity. It's really a market-driven program. So it's really Eastern Massachusetts, South Shore, Cape Cod. It's not an issue in Western Mass, or if you live in, let's say Athol, the market there is somewhat, obviously the economy is not as good and there's not as many jobs, but they're able to produce enough housing to meet the needs. I think 40B, frankly, has become the only way to develop housing in certain communities because also a lot of towns have passed the Community Preservation Act, and usually what they do is try to buy up as much open space as they can. So we're seeing less and less housing to be developed, and as we all know, they don't make land, so 40B has become the only method to construct things. But as far as my message, as far as housing production plan certification, I advise all communities to adopt them. We have seen it sort of force an alliance in some communities. If they need 58 units to get 2 years off, a developer will come in and develop, guess what, a 58-unit complex under a friendly process because they know the town wants to get 2 years breathing space. So it's worked in that effect. It's not a perfect system, but it's given some communities help. And I just urge all communities to adopt one. So that's just my contact information. I'm not sure if we're going into Q&A or if you're going to speak briefly or, okay, sorry.
Okay. Our town planner, Ray Goff, is going to be coming up. And if anybody has more questions, as soon as Ray's done, we'll be banging through as many of these questions as we can. So, and I also didn't notice him sneak in. He was here at the beginning, but I didn't notice him. Our town administrator, Jack Hathaway, is here, as well as the administrator for the Norfolk Housing Affordable Housing Trust, Sue Jacobson. So thank you guys for coming as well.
Okay. Thanks for coming. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. My presentation is really just focused on Norfolk and where we are right now, where we're going, and how we might get there. Currently, we have 311 as our goal for affordable housing. We have 129 affordable units in town, and we need about 182 to get to our 311. We are working on that. There has been some recent progress by the town. One of the things I wanted to mention to folks, some folks don't even know it, I didn't realize, some of the folks from the state did not realize, but the town has been working with our Affordable Housing Trust and creating affordable units using state funds to create these affordable units, as well as our inclusionary zoning that we have in place. So they've created in the last 6 years 19 units. I believe it's 19 units, and I'm not sure about the 6 years, but we did create 19 units locally that this has quietly been happening over the years, and the town's been steadily working towards creating more affordable housing opportunities. The slide that's up here is something I think that most folks in town want to know is what projects do we have in the pipeline. Some folks have been around with the Lakeland Farms project, the 106, 108 Main Street project, and have most recently we have another project at 144 Seekonk that has gotten a lot of attention from people in town. But there are other projects too. There's a meeting house project which is back behind Town Hall. It's the last remaining 20 units of affordable housing from an earlier meeting house project that had 44 units in total. There's also another project before the zoning board called 25 Rockwood Road. But I just wanted to kind of give everyone a list as to where we stand right now. At the bottom of that list, you can see, I'm not sure if you can scroll that up just a little bit. I just want to be brief on this. I don't want to get involved in too many. Is it on? Can you hear? It's on. You're just too far away from it. Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay.
Thank you.
A little tall for this mic, sorry. But I wanted to just show that, in this list where we have projects that are in the pipeline, those projects don't get us to where we need to be. We do need to do more. The Affordable Housing Production Plan is one place that we're going to be focusing our attention on. And moving into that, we have just recently had a meeting with our consultant who we have hired, the Affordable Housing Trust, and Sue Jacobson, who's our Affordable Housing Director, has been working with the consultants to work on that. We've got some community meetings, 2 community meetings coming up, one in July, one in September, for folks to come in. We'll talk about what we want for Norfolk, what we think that would be appropriate in our town, and ways to maybe achieve some of these goals without maybe dealing with some of the onerous requirements of 40B and the impacts that are happening to some of our neighborhoods. As one of the earlier slides had said, we had a plan, a housing production plan that was approved in 2007. It expired in 2012. We've been working without a plan in place for the last few years, and we're working on now changing some of that. This next slide, which you can very briefly go through, this shows some work that I did that shows the how we could achieve safe harbor in different ways. And I was looking for my copy so I can just sort of follow along. But so 6 different ways that I've looked at. The first, of course, is to achieve your 10%, which we already went through. The second is really to deal with the land area. And in looking at Norfolk, I'm just jumping down to the yellow part. So Norfolk has 6,053 eligible acres of land area. We had a GIS consultant do some of this work for me and come up with what land area we do have. 1.5% gives us about 90 acres that would have to be exceeded by the total land area for affordable housing. And there's currently approximately 24 acres of land being used for affordable housing, leaving us short by about 66 acres. I'm not sure we're going to make it on that one. The next one would be meet the 0.3 of 1% of the 10 acres. And we already saw a slide that said that no one's ever made that one. I don't think we're going to make it on that one either. That gives us about 18 acres to meet. So the 10, because it's whichever is higher, so you could be 10 acres or the 18 acres, we're going to have to meet the 18 acres on that one. I'm not holding a lot of hope for that one either. And then number 4 would be create an increase of over 2% in one calendar year. And that number gives us about 63 acres that we have to create in one calendar year. The Boyd's Crossing project, which was approved last year, was a 40-unit project, and that gave us 10 units. So you can kind of get a sense as to what we're up against in trying to meet that requirement. And then number 5 is a 200-unit project. Anything above 200 units could be denied by the town based on this project too large for the community. And then the last would be the same project, so a similar project in the same year. So those kind of give you a framework as to how we're working and what we have to work with. We have community workshops for our housing production plan on July 17th. I meant to mention that earlier, and September 14th. Those are locked-in dates, so if you wanted to write those down, those will be at, I believe, either Town Hall, the library, or here, depending on what we have for a crowd. I can give you more information. We'll have more information on the town website, too. I think that's about it that I wanted to throw out at you and just sort of start the question and answer period off at this point. So thank you.
Just moving the mic over here. So we are filming this for NCTV. Hopefully more people in town can learn about this and find out some more. I'm going to go through, we have a whole stack of questions. I'm going to try to go through them as quickly as possible. I'm sure that we don't want to stay here till midnight. One of the things I just want to point out, I'm a small government guy, so therefore I'm not a fan of the 40B law. I believe that a town should manage its own destiny. I believe we should be able to make our own rules and our own regulations and follow our own zoning. And really, as long as they're not discriminatory or overly restrictive, I think that's what we should be doing. And there's a lot of other legislators that believe the same as I do. We filed 150 bills this year to change 40B, to make it less restrictive, and to repeal 40B. But the reality is, unfortunately, the leadership in the House is an urban leadership. The Democratic majority is predominantly located in the cities, and so they are not willing to let any of these come out of committee. So we're not even getting these to the House floor to discuss it and debate it. So that's one of the frustrations. So what we are stuck with is the law. And while I think this law is horrible and it's unfair, I understand its purpose. Its purpose is noble, its purpose is good, but the reality is we have to live within this law. And these people are doing a great job of dealing within the law. Their mission and their goal is to implement this law and deal with it accordingly. So that's kind of where our hands are tied. And the reality is that these developers are coming in, and this is not about affordable for the developers. There's not any noble developers, or I shouldn't say none. I've never met this noble developer that's coming in trying to really do it for affordable. It's about profitability. And the reality is they use this 40B law to force a higher density to maximize their profits. And that's the reality that we have to live with because we're below the 10%. And we're going to become more of a target from the standpoint of, a couple of these numbers are a little bit outdated in so much because of 2 projects, or 3 projects in Rentham and 2 projects in Plainville. They are both, Plainville's now going to be at 17% by the end of this year. And Rentham's going to be about 12.5%. So it's making this area much more difficult. Medfield needs 21 to hit their safe harbor provision. They have, as soon as their zoning board meets, they will hopefully approve the last 4, and so that will put them in a safe harbor provision. And then they're doing a large-scale town-owned elderly housing project that they're going to be expanding on, which will give them safe harbor for next year as well. So the reality is we have to worry about this in Norfolk because we're going to become much more of a rich target. We're a wealthy community. It's very profitable for these to come in, and so we have to make sure we understand this law and work within this law because unfortunately overturning it and getting some relief from the legislature is probably not likely in this current cycle. We're going to continue to fight. There's a lot of legislators, especially suburban legislators, on both sides of the aisle, Republican, Democrat, this isn't a purely Democratic thing, but we have to make sure that we understand this is the law that we're stuck with it. So without further ado, I'll start heading through these questions. And whoever wants to grab each one of these, we'll grab it. Okay. How is this really an affordable housing law when the percentage is so small, all that the developer has to offer at an affordable cost is the 25%, and are some communities exempt from 10% of affordable housing, such as Dover? Make sense?
Yeah, I would say so. No communities are exempt from the 10%, other than the city of Boston, I think, is they've got their own zoning.
But they have more than 10%.
Right, and Boston is well over 10%, they're probably closer to 20%, 18%, sorry. As far as 25%, part of the way 40B works from an economic model is an internal subsidy. If you said, let's make 100% of all the units affordable, really affordable down to say 30% AMI, 40% AMI, you would need very, very deep public subsidies. If you're able to create a unit of 100 unit 40B development, 25 affordable, the 75 units that are market rate, in a way, create an internal subsidy to help make the project viable, if that makes sense. So it's almost, I know in Cambridge, there's always these arguments, or City of Boston now, because it's incredibly expensive. Let's do 100% affordable everywhere. The numbers just don't work like that. So generally 25% is the way to make it work. And yes, it's not as much as affordable housing as we needed, but the argument that if we get rid of 40B, everything will happen. If we were to take 75,000 units out, that we'd have more affordable housing, less supply, less options. I guess you can believe it if you want, but I don't think it's true.
Next question. Why can't developers follow local zoning laws provided that they're not overly restrictive or discriminatory? What is the purpose of allowing so many waivers? The 40B near my house had over 45 waivers.
So I'll attempt this question. I think it's really closely tied to what Phil just discussed, is that there are no more public subsidies to fund the affordable housing production under 40B. So the developer is essentially providing that subsidy through the development. So the density that they're able to obtain out of a process that has much more flexible zoning associated with it is what makes it economically feasible for them to include any number of affordable units. And what they are required to do, as Phil just said, is either 20% at 50% of AMI or 25% at 80% AMI. And while that number isn't always what represents the need in a given community, it's a number that holds the developer accountable. So the flexible zoning is really at the core of what the developer is able to take advantage of to make it work for them. And in exchange for that is the affordability. That's really, those two things are what make it work for both parties.
Okay, thank you. I know Phil, you kind of touched on this real quick, but maybe you can follow back. If a housing production plan is filed today, what steps will go through, and how long will it take before it gets approved in order to be able to get to a safe harbor?
Well, the safe harbor depends on really what's happening locally, but as far as the regulations, we have 30 days to give initial comment period back. Usually, that's never really a problem. Frankly, sometimes communities will submit drafts to me and I'll get comments back. So once we get the plan in place, I can get comments back sometimes in a week or two. And because there's a fairly small group of consultants around the state doing these, the plans are usually in pretty good shape when they come to me. They may need some tweaking, but it's not like it was 10 years ago. By regulations, we have 90 days to approve the plan or it would be deemed effective. But we've been able to meet all these deadlines so far. As far as certification, it really depends what's happening. If your plan was approved today and you approved a large 40B tomorrow, you could be certified on day 3. It really depends what's happening locally.
And from personal experience, I know Medfield, we were able to file Medfield and we had it approved by about 30 days.
Yeah.
Almost spot on 30 days.
Right.
It was a pretty quick process by the time they filed it and approved it. Speaking of Medfield hired attorney Jay Tom and to kill the 40B project there. Does the town need to hire an attorney in order to get a denial?
Can I please answer that? Totally serious.
So I don't think a town does need necessarily an attorney to navigate that process. In the case of the proposal in Medfield, that project not moving forward was a decision by Mass Housing that the proposal did not meet the criteria that the regulations and the guidelines have put forward. So, that really is part of our role in determining whether or not a project has met the criteria that the state has established for whether a project is appropriate for that initial determination of eligibility. So in that case, we were not able to make those findings, and we cited the reasons in our letter. And we had conversation with you and Representative Garlick around, what our reasons were behind that.
And just speaking as a person who works in government affairs, because I deal with a lot of the electeds, we didn't have any conversations with Mr. Tallerman about Medfield. I hear him saying a lot about the work he did on that, but Representative Dooley and Representative Garlick and their staffs were on the phone with us quite a lot, and we had a lot of meetings with them. I didn't see Mr. Tallerman until we went to the State House to tell Representative Dooley and Representative Garlick of our decision, so we never met with him or talked to him about that.
Next question. Where does the money come from for subsidies for the developers? And has there been any thought given to allow credit toward the 10% requirements to communities with state prisons? Oh, sorry, that's two kind of questions. So money for the subsidies for developers.
So that's really part of the problem that speaks back to why do they have to have the ability to override our zoning is tied to the fact that there are no real subsidies for this kind of work. There are some limited situations where a developer is essentially using 40B as the zoning mechanism, and they do have access to some scarce subsidies. One of those would be the low-income housing tax credit program. And that really depends on the nature of the developer. So I think a point you made earlier where most developers are just looking to make money. There are people that come through and use the 40B process to promote developments through nonprofits and agencies that really are intended to develop affordable housing. And some of those are the Planning Office for Urban Affairs under the Archdiocese, and Preservation of Affordable Housing, Neighborhood of Affordable. There's a number of those kinds of developers that we work with whose mission is to create affordable housing. So in their case, they are tending to do much deeper levels of affordability, but they're also set up to pursue multiple layers of subsidy to make a deal work and to enhance the level of affordability.
And just a follow-up question, has there been any credit or any discussion around the communities that actually house state prisons? Because obviously, those are really affordable.
In a sense. Well, in general, the
Really low income levels, it's phenomenal.
Actually, it's really expensive to.
We subsidize them,
Yeah.
very
I did see the president.
It's really, don't
There
pay.
actually, as you were saying, every year there's tons of bills filed in 40B, and I don't know if someone filed the prison bill this year, as they call it, but every year somebody files the bill to count prisons as affordable housing. And the reality is, according to our guidelines, there has to be affirmative marketing, deed restriction, affordable at 80% AMI, and prisons wouldn't meet any of the criteria. I mean, if that was ever to happen, it would be just purely a political decision. So if you ever get into bills moving, maybe a little higher.
I was going to say that it is bill filing again this year.
Okay, there you go.
Whoever asked the question, thank you. Let's see, the statutory intent was to limit the impact of so-called exclusionary bylaws and zoning, while minimum lot size, acreage setbacks may potentially be exclusionary. Please comment on why environmental protections such as wetlands, buffer zones are also often disregarded.
So I think I would start by saying that no environmental regulation or treatment is dismissed as it relates to a state requirement. So the State Wetlands Protection Act is not overridden by a developer applying under Chapter 40B. They have to meet all of the obligations under the State Wetlands Protection Act, the State Rivers Act, state stormwater management policies and procedures. So any requirement relative to environmental stewardship and management that the state imposes is in full force and effect, and can't be set aside. And you can't even really negotiate on things like that with respect to the comprehensive permit process at the local hearing. What can be waived is what might be more restrictive local bylaws or ordinances. And so that has become a way where communities have been able to impose limits and restrictions that are maybe outside of zoning, but that still have the same effect of making it really challenging to create any kind of housing.
Thank you. How long is deed restriction on both a for sale property and a rental property?
Sure. A minimum of 15 years for rental, minimum of 30 years for ownership, but the reality is everything we're doing now is pretty much perpetuity. So these things don't go market rate anymore. Some of the early projects did before we adopted the universal deed rider, but virtually everything now is in perpetuity, 99 years.
Okay. I'd just like to add to that because I think affordability is really the most important part of this and we take it really seriously. And there's two things that ensure the perpetual affordability of these units. One is tied to case law. There was a case known as Ardmore v. Wellesley. And the premise of that case law, I don't want to get into it because it would be a long story, but the premise is...
That's exciting.
Yeah, everyone loves to hear about case law, right?
Very exciting.
The premise is that for as long as the development is not in compliance with the underlying zoning, the units must remain affordable. So that's hard to get out from under unless the community decides we're going to change our zoning and accommodate what's been built here. The other thing, and Phil mentioned the deed restriction for sale developments, Mass Housing and others work very closely with Fannie Mae to ensure that affordability restriction would survive foreclosure, which really helped to ensure that long-term affordability. That's something that deed riders for a number, I think it was 2006 or 7, where that universal deed rider was negotiated with Fannie Mae and other partners. And when that provision was added to the restriction, it really helped to ensure that long-term affordability.
Norfolk has, this is one I was talking to Nancy about last week, Norfolk has one 40B that has been completed several years ago, but the cost certification has still yet to be completed. How is the state improving controls to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
So as I mentioned in my presentation, I feel like cost certification is a big part of how we demonstrate that we're upholding our part of the bargain in overseeing these programs and making sure that developers are following the rules that apply to them. Again, going back to updates to the regulations in 2008, DHCD imposed a condition on every developer coming to a subsidizing housing agency for final approval that you had to set aside financial surety to basically bring them into compliance with that cost certification requirement. So we actually hold money that they are not entitled to have returned to them until they complete that process. Now, in the case of that project that has been completed, that was in place before those regulation changes happened. And so we were not holding surety in that instance, but we have worked both with the town and the developer to bring them to a place where they will undertake compliance for that particular requirement. So that is, based on my most recent understanding, something that the developer has agreed to undertake. And even though he did not have that surety requirement applied to him, he still is going to meet that obligation.
A certified HPP requires 16 building permits in Norfolk, provided that it's not, unless it's a rental development. I'm not sure what that means, but how would you address the issue that public sees safe harbor as something that can happen when in reality, unless it's a rental, it's very difficult to happen?
Yeah, that's a good one for you.
But, you know, the key.
I probably figure out what they mean by rental. There's just no rental
Yeah.
aspect really in Norfolk. Norfolk
Right.
is purely a bedroom,
Yeah.
home ownership community. There's not really any rental.
It's a good point in sense, because under the 40B, which is the way we count it, the affordable units, if you've got a 4-unit ownership 40B, only 1 unit counts. If you have 4 units rental, 4 units count. So it is a lot harder if you're just doing ownership to get to safe harbor. It's still possible, but you'd actually have to build quite a few more units, and that's why so many communities are turning towards rental housing. And frankly, the reason we count rental housing at 100% is to encourage just that production of rental housing.
Let's see, I can answer this question real quick. As far as how the housing number keeps changing, it only does every 10 years. So our housing number will, when the U.S. Census comes out in 2020, probably by 2021, we will have a new number, and that will be our new affordable housing goal, and also it'll set our new housing benchmark. So it doesn't reset every time we do a project. We're not doing 300 units, and then that increases our need by another 30. It only happens every 10 years. The question is, our affordable, let's see, does the state pay for any need to improve water supply, provided that it's needed for a 40B development?
So it's a good question, and it's usually part of the process of negotiating approval for the comprehensive permit. So there are occasions where the community will impose a condition on approval that requires a developer to mitigate impacts to municipal infrastructure. So part of that could be solving for a water or sewer related impact. What can also happen is that the municipality and the developer could partner and make an application to the state for funding through a program such as MassWorks. MassWorks is broadly used to address local infrastructure needs, and there are actually a fair number of incentives within some of these state programs that if there is a housing component to a particular request for funding, there's a lot more likelihood of receiving that funding from various state programs.
And out of personal experience, the large project in Rentham, which is going to be 150 apartments.
Yeah, right. That's right.
One of the things we were able to do is bring down the MassWorks grant, and I was able to get $2.2 million for Rentham, purely for water infrastructure. So that's bringing up water from the center of town, and that was how the project actually became viable from that standpoint. So, the money is out there. It's not. I wish it was easy. We got a little lucky that we had the bandwidth and everything kind of fell together. But a little more difficult in town of Norfolk. I think one of the main concerns is we're running out of water from the standpoint of our well capacity and our actual water capacity for our residents that are here is pretty much at the edge. And so that's one of the big things. It's not like we're tapped into the Quabbin or something along those lines and we can just run another line. So I think that is a larger, broader discussion that we'll have obviously when we're discussing all these things. Could you please speak to any efforts or plans to adjust 40B so it is more adaptable and appropriate to unique communities and towns like Norfolk? Is there any ability to take into account the rural nature, and the lack of density, or does that not really fall into the process?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this, but I mean, 40B dates back to 1969, and we've had numerous regulatory changes, 2003, 2008, the most recent one. I can't say too much about it, because frankly, I don't know. I'm not at that sort of level, but I think if there are regulatory changes, I think eventually will happen. There may be significant changes at some point, and I know that's not really a straight answer. I just don't know.
You emphasize more houses on less space, which creates a major tax revenue problem for a town like Norfolk. What can be done to protect towns
that are substantially reliant on property taxes, residential property taxes, with no commercial base?
Well, 40B is not a program driven by tax policy and structure. So that's an issue that may be on the edges. And while it may be a concern locally, I don't, my experience, and I was a municipal planner for more years than I've been doing this work on behalf of the state. And, you know, that's a very project-specific proposition. There are plenty of housing developments, whether under 40B or conventionally permitted under 40A, that are revenue positive. So housing and more dense housing is not necessarily a losing proposition from a local property tax perspective. That being said, it does come with costs too. So, you know, that's one of the things that are always in play. But the 40B statute and the regulations and guidelines around it really aren't addressing the financial implications. It's very much focused on the zoning part of the equation.
And there's not a lot, but there is some precedent at the Housing Appeals Committee that Middleborough, for one example, was able to stop a 40B going into industrial park because the town, through a planning tool and a master plan, had this area identified for an expansion of an existing industrial park. And the agency actually agreed with the town, so they were able to keep that for industrial space. So I'm not saying that's going to happen a lot, but it can happen.
What percentage of applications are denied?
I can speak to Mass Housing's role or track record in that regard, and we don't deny many. I'll be very honest about that, and I think that's something that people. That's probably most people's impression. But we have said no to about 5% of the projects that have come our way, and we have had a pretty significant number over the years. And even I think we looked in the past 3 years, we've said no to 6 different proposals.
How many?
What's that?
How many did? 6 out of how many?
Oh. Probably close to 90.
Okay.
And, you know, again, just part of what is, part of the reason that happens, and I just always drive Greg crazy because he's a lot smarter than me and I just do the simplified version of everything, but it's that the threshold, as Greg explained, is really low. It only has to be generally suitable for housing for it to get its initial approval from Mass Housing, which you hear called site approval or project eligibility. And then once that happens, that's when we always would call it kind of the ticket to ride, right? That's when it goes on to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and that's when a city or town makes their determination as to whether they're going to accept or reject that application. So.
I don't understand this one, but maybe you guys will. Does Mass Housing consider smart growth density appropriate?
Smart growth density.
Appropriate. Did you say
Do
appropriate?
we consider smart growth density appropriate?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure the exact definition or meaning of smart growth in that context. Chapter 40R is oftentimes referred to as the smart growth zoning process for the Commonwealth. And in case we haven't talked about 40R, other than to say a few communities have done that as a way of undertaking their own housing production efforts. The premise with 40R is that instead of a developer coming in and imposing a development on the community decides to zone for more dense housing development, and in return for doing that zoning, they get incentive payments. So you get a payment for undertaking the zoning, and then you get additional payments for every unit that actually gets built and permitted under that smart growth zoning district. So in those cases, the density really is aligned pretty closely with what 40B allows, and it also has the affordability requirements that come along with it. So beyond that, that's a very specific example of smart growth. We also do have developers complete what we refer to as a sustainable development scorecard for each application submitted to Mass Housing, and that is basically looking at ways that particular project addresses smart growth or sustainable development features within the proposed development. So we look at things like, do they have creative ways of dealing with stormwater, or are they being respectful of environmental resources and things of that nature?
Is there a maximum number of developer or person-related parties that can have open and process at the same time? Different 40Bs at the same time, I guess they're saying?
So can a community consider an infinite number of?
No, can one developer put in 20 different applications? Does Mass Housing or DHCD, that's how I'm reading it, what are the maximum number of 40Bs a person or related party can have open or in process at the same time?
I'm not aware of any limitation on a development entity being able to pursue a limited number of applications at any one time. And usually the nature of the applicant entity that is before us and the community is a single purpose entity that was formed for that specific development. So it may have common participants and members of that limited liability corporation, but usually there's a singular entity for each one of these developments.
How can a project be approved for multi-housing development when originally the land was approved by the town for one home?
For one home?
For one home, single-family house.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's really the premise of Chapter 40B is that if we were to allow every community to adopt restrictive zoning and require larger lots and that would lead to larger homes and more expensive housing. If that was the only way that housing got built in the Commonwealth, one, we wouldn't have enough housing to sustain our economy and to provide places to live for people looking to work in the Commonwealth, which is really an important issue, much more broad than housing itself. But I think it starts to create problems with federal fair housing law as well. And that's something that we didn't really talk about other than to say that it's part of the affordability monitoring process that we undertake and that we work with our partners around. But at its core, we have to allow for everyone to have an opportunity to pursue housing.
And just a couple more, I know we need to wrap up with the school, because we have to be up by now. How is existing older housing evaluated toward the town's 40B percentage?
In order to count towards the 40B, frankly, an existing house without any deed restriction, regulatory agreement, public subsidy involved, that's not affirmative market, it wouldn't count as affordable.
Regardless of the price?
Regardless of the price point.
Yep.
How is the house price determined to make it affordable, bought, sold, and again when resold?
You want it? Okay, yes, sir.
There are deed restrictions on the home, so say if you bought a home now at $150,000, there's formula based, you can make money on it, but your profit is capped, so you can't sell a $150,000 house in 3 years for $350,000. You can probably sell that $150,000 house based on a number of factors and for $152,000 to another affordable buyer. So you can make some money, but your profit's capped.
And how is the price determined?
The initial sales price is set by the subsidizing agency. So, round all figures, if you get a $350,000 townhouse, the 40B one could sell for, let's say, $180 to $220, depending on where you are in the state. And that's very round ball. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Oh, that was what you already did.
Okay, got it. Right.
You did the second part first.
Yeah, and if you want to do capital improvements, but then when you go to resell it, there's something called a monitoring agent. Now at DHCD, we monitor all our own units, so we have to approve the sales price. And that's the same sort of process, whether it's mass housing or mass development. A third party has formulas to determine sales price. It has to go to another eligible buyer.
How much profit is a 40B developer entitled to make?
So I mentioned that briefly during my presentation. For a for-sale development where you're selling a home or a condo, the developer is restricted to not more than 20% of total development costs, and that's measured against the revenue generated from the sales of the units at that project. In the time that I've been at Mass Housing, and that's really when the cost certification requirements went into the regulations around this, and that all of the agencies adopted very comparable cost certification policies and procedures. There's only one project that I'm aware of having exceeded that profit limitation. And in that case, money was returned to the community and was available for use for affordable housing purposes. For rental developments, the developer is restricted to a certain percentage of what they're allowed to draw from the development on an annual basis. So that's restricted to a 10% annual distribution. And that number is arrived at by looking at the equity that the developer has in the development, measured against the debt that they're carrying as well.
I'll do two more. Why aren't abutters of 40B notified before 40B is applied for, so they can be part of the petitioning process to the town? So I can't read the rest of it.
So, I guess going back to my local planning background, any direct abutter or abutters to abutters should be notified of a public hearing before the local zoning board of appeals. That's how that process works. There should also be, I would imagine, some general town notices that reflect that as well. As far as notifications for the review that's undertaken by Mass Housing, we don't have a public hearing or public notice requirement associated with our administrative review. What we do is we notify the community of the application, and the community is then put on notice to provide us with comments. So the community can then make that known to anyone who might be interested in providing additional comments. So we do broadly accept and receive comments from any interested party. That could be not just town officials and elected people representing the community, but residents as well.
Okay, and final question, and I apologize, we have a lot more questions. What I'll try to do is compile them and get people from Mass Housing, DHCD, to answer them. And what we'll do is we'll make sure we get all the slideshows put on. Talk to Mr. Hathaway, get them put on the town website. This is filmed and will be available on by NCTV, so we'll get that out there. And what we'll do is compile the rest of these questions and also try to summarize some of the other questions. So we have that as a follow-up list on the town website. That's all right. Okay, Jack says it's okay. Right. So final question regarding site eligibility. How is an individual product ultimately approved? Is it by a vote of Mass Housing employees, or is it computer-generated analysis, et cetera? As in, you need to meet 6 out of 10 requirements. So a general threshold is met, and please be specific. This seems to be a mystery to the public. Good final question.
Yeah, not a yes or no answer, I suppose, but so I think it's a little bit of both art and science tied to this. So there are criteria that we have to meet as a subsidizing agency in undertaking this review, and those criteria are all listed in the presentation that I had up earlier. I glossed over some of them, but we have relatively general findings that we're asked to make about the suitability of the applicant, the suitability of the site, the concept that they have put forward for how they would develop that site. And there are times where you see a proposal and we know that it's not right for that site, or it doesn't, it's not going to bring us to a place where we can meet those required findings. And one of two things will happen in those instances. If it's an applicant or developer who we feel like is ready and willing to work with us and the community, we may push back and suggest that they consider alternatives to their initial proposal. and they go back to the drawing board and come up with another and more suitable proposal. And we had an example of a case along those lines. And there are other instances where we have just flat out said no. And as I said earlier, that doesn't happen a lot, but there are some exceptional cases where the proposal just does not meet those criteria that we're asked to make findings around. So I'm not sure if that answers it as specifically as the person was looking for, but that's really kind of the premise behind our undertaking the review.
And I can speak to the Bethel, one, that came out before their review. They sent it back and said, this is not going to meet our criteria based on these different things. Please refile and resubmit. And I think they had it in the gazebo.
Right.
So I mean, there was not a whole lot of change, which added to the denial. So if they would have come back with something substantially different, much more fitting with the neighborhood and things like that, we might have been in for a much longer and more difficult battle. But I guess fortunately for us, they really didn't take Mass Housing's thoughts seriously, and they didn't really adjust their proposal much at all. So that's one of the other things. Also, anyone else that has any other questions, please send them over to me. I will compile them as well on the rest of these. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for all of your hard work, and I look forward to having a great relationship, continuing to have a great relationship with you guys. This is important to Norfolk. Norfolk's not, I know it's snob zoning. That's not why this is we're doing this. We're a community that cares. Our schools are at our maximum. Our water is at our maximum. Our tax base is one of the highest in the area. This isn't done for and as a giving community, we house 4 of the state's prisons. So we are doing our part. And I think what we wanted to make sure is let the public understand what the law is, and that you guys aren't just evil bad guys that are they're trying to jam this down our throat with some sinister plot. But we also wanted you to hear from us and have understand of our questions and concerns, that it isn't about snob appeal. We're not trying to discriminate. We're not trying to eliminate. And we have we have been using the Community Preservation Act to buy our houses, and we've been doing it as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, one of the problems with the lack of density in the town and being a small town, we don't have enough money, and we don't have the ability to do the a large-scale apartment building, things along those lines. But we've done 19 over the past couple of years, and we've been very active. We've done 40R zoning. We have the housing production plan, and we have the committee that's been active on this for 7 years, 8 years, that have been actively buying up land, buying houses, and flipping them, and selling them back putting them into the program as a loss. And so we really want to have this. We have some programs. We have a lot of 40Bs right now that are friendly, and unfortunately we have a couple hostile. We are willing to work with developers. I'm not speaking as someone as an official of the town. I'm not an official of the town. I'm speaking as a resident. We're very passionate about this, and we really wanted to thank you guys for giving up your Wednesday evening and coming down and speaking to us. And thank you all very much for coming.